Good morning, everyone. Find your seats and stop shaking hands of the people next to you if you'd like. And welcome to CCN. My name is Daphna Shohami. I'm a member of the steering committee, and I have the great privilege and honor today to introduce our first keynote speaker, Dr. Alison Gopnik, who's a professor of psychology and philosophy at Berkeley. Many of us got started on this path because we wanted to find the answers to truly big questions about the human mind. Why do we think the way we do? How do we make inferences? How do young children, who seem sometimes actually incredibly clueless, manage to construct a rich understanding of the world around them with all its quirks and irregularities? And I think one of the challenges that really unites all of us here at CCN is not just understanding the answers to these questions, but to understand how we can interrogate these big questions in a way that is rigorous, computational, and mechanistic, while keeping intact the enormous mystery that's embedded in the very processes that we're interested in. I think of all the philosophers and psychologists who have tried for hundreds of years really to do this and answer these questions, Alison's work has always stood out to me as striking that very elusive balance, explaining the mysteries of the mind without explaining them away. Alison's work stands out not just for its rigor and its elegance, but also for its impact outside of science. Alison has become a voice for science and society, an advocate for rational thinking and scientific method at a time when this is more needed than ever. In addition to her unbelievably large volume of scientific papers, Alison has managed to publish several award-winning popular books, and she's written for The New Yorker, The Guardian, The New York Times, as well as a regular column for The Wall Street Journal. One of my favorites is an essay in the New York Times from last year titled, "4-Year-Olds Don't Act Like Trump." Spoiler alert, it's because they are smarter. Thankfully, Alison is not here today to tell us about Trump, but to share with us some of the fascinating and important discoveries that have emerged from her work about how young minds make inferences, develop concepts, and learn, and how these processes relate to the sort of computational mechanisms that we at CCN are all interested in. So please join me in welcoming Alison Gopnik.
Thanks very much for that. Thanks very much for that introduction, and thanks very much for inviting me. I was so pleased when this group got started, because it seems to me to be a group that is very, very much needed and one whose time has very much come. For some 20 years now, I've been trying to combine computational ideas with empirical work in psychology and cognitive science, and more recently tried to make the link to neuroscience as well. And those interdisciplinary conversations are hard to have, and it's great to have a group like this that's making them happen. What I want to do today is extend that conversation to yet another discipline, namely evolutionary biology. And what I want to do is to start out by talking about an idea that's crucial in evolutionary biology, but sort of understudied underknown in cognitive science and psychology. And this is the idea of life history. If you imagine a biologist from Alpha Centauri arriving on Earth 150,000 years ago and trying to figure out what's special about this new group of creatures that have evolved, she would not have noticed big differences between humans and the other creatures that were around on a lot of dimensions that we might think of now. Things like culture hadn't yet emerged. But one thing that would really strike her is the very striking differences in the life history of human beings and of our closest relatives. So this is a chimp in the Gombe, a 7-year-old chimp, and by the time chimps are 7 years old, they're already producing as much food as they're consuming. So they're already pretty self-sufficient by 7. For humans, even in forager cultures, this isn't happening until children are at least 15 years old. In our culture, my son is just turned 30. And so, in other words, we have twice as long a childhood as our closest primate relatives do, and arguably a longer childhood than any other animal does. And that childhood, that long time, by definition, childhood is costly. Childhood is about a period in the life of an organism when it's incapable of taking care of itself and it needs to be taken care of by others. And we also have much more parental investment. We have not only biological mothers, but biological fathers who are pair bonded and involved in caring for children. We have alloparents, other people who are involved in taking care of children. We have my personal favorite postmenopausal grandmothers who are involved in taking care of children. So we have a big investment in these children, and the children are immature for a long time. That seems puzzling. Why would we quickly, in evolutionary terms, have included a design which seems to be so costly? These kids aren't producing anything, and they're actually requiring a lot of work and investment on the part of adults. Now, our Alpha Centauran biologist would have looked at this, and assuming that Alpha Centauran biology is well advanced, maybe even to the point where cognitive scientists would know about it, she would have noticed this a pattern in particular, because very often these differences in life history and evolutionary biology turn out to be very closely related to differences in cognitive and neural characteristics. In particular, across an incredibly wide range of species, the period of immaturity is correlated with what perhaps we anthropomorphically think of as intelligence, things like flexibility and learning and being able to adapt to many different kinds of environments. In fact, the first animals where this was noticed were not even mammals, but birds. So if you compare, for example, in that slide, you compare on one side is a New Caledonian crow, and crows and corvids and ravens. Crows and ravens, corvids in general, are incredibly intelligent birds. New Caledonian crows have tool-using abilities that actually surpass those of chimpanzees and primates. On the other hand, you can compare those animals with our friend the domestic chicken, and with apologies to any chicken lovers in the audience. In Philadelphia, I probably don't have to say this as much as I do in Berkeley. Chickens are basically dumb as stumps, or another way of putting it is that even though chickens have computational capacities well designed to peck for grain, those capacities are pretty much in place by the time the chickens are born. There's actually empirical evidence that shows this. And they don't change. Chickens don't seem to learn very much about the world around them. Now, those chickens are also mature within a couple of weeks. They already have the computational capacities that they need. In contrast, the crows are immature, or fledglings, for as long as a year, and these New Caledonian crows are fledglings for as long as 2 years. It's a very long time in the life of a bird. And you see this not only for crows and chickens, but across birds. You see this relationship between the altricial animals, as they're known, like the crows, that are more intelligent, have a longer period of immaturity, and the precocial ones, like the chickens, that don't. The other slide shows that this same pattern can be seen for primates. This is a recent PNAS paper. It can even be seen for marsupials, who have a very different lifestyle in lots of ways. Nevertheless, if you compare marsupials, you can see this relationship between the period of immaturity and brain size. So on one side, there's the quokka, the world's cutest animal. On the other, about the same sized animal, the Virginia opossum, possibly the world's dumbest animal. Well, that's a little much. I mean, certainly one of the dumber mammals. And the quokkas have one baby at a time. They have pair bonding so that there's a lot of parental investment. And the babies stay inside of the mother's pouch for as long as a year. The opossums, on the other hand, as you can see, have many babies. Only the biological mother cares for the babies, and the babies are swiftly mature. And the quokka's brains are twice as big as the possum's brains. And again, this isn't just true of quokkas and possums, it's true very generally. My favorite recent example of this, just to show how general this pattern is in evolution, is a beautiful empirical study, and there's also been some really beautiful theoretical work by an evolutionary biologist named Emily Snell-Rood. And what she did was she actually looked at insects. So insects, of course, are way out on the end of the spectrum compared to us. They only live for about 2 weeks. They have hundreds and hundreds of eggs at a time. It looks as if they're totally different from us. But even among insects, she looked at cabbage white butterflies, and she discovered that if you look at slightly different genetic strains of these butterflies, There's one group who are very well designed to look for green plants like cabbages. And essentially, it turns out that the Very Hungry Caterpillar tells you everything that you need to know about caterpillar life history. What caterpillars do is they go out, they find a nice green leaf, they lay a bunch of eggs, the eggs hatch into caterpillars, the caterpillars eat all the food that's on the leaf. They probably don't have cupcakes and hot dogs, but they certainly eat the leaf, and then they produce butterflies. So it turns out that some of these genetic variants just go to green leaves and lay their eggs, and that's it. There are other genetic variants, however, that are capable of flitting around from leaf to leaf, sensing the nutritional chemicals in the leaves, and learning to go to leaves of plants like chard, which are not initially green, but which they discover actually are potentially good sites for their eggs. And these butterflies are also capable of doing things like checking to see whether there's already an egg on a leaf planted by another butterfly before they decide whether to lay their own eggs. So in other words, what you've got are relatively inflexible, chicken-like varieties of cabbage whites, and you have relatively flexible animals that learn more human-like cabbage whites. And again, the period of immaturity is twice as long for the ones that are better at learning than the ones that aren't as good at learning, and they produce half as many eggs. So even in this very general, even in this extremely different species, you see this very striking relationship between the degree of flexibility, the intelligence, the reliance on learning, and the period of immaturity. And what that suggests is that this relationship is the result of something very general about the way that learning works and the way that development works. And what I proposed is that a way of explaining this relationship, and people in evolutionary biology have proposed things that are similar to this, is this way. If you try and think about what intelligence is, what it means to say that a creature is intelligent, one way of thinking about that is what range of solutions can a creature search? What range of solutions can a creature consider in order to be able to solve a particular problem? And our general sense is that more intelligent creatures are capable of considering a wider range of potential hypotheses, potential solutions, potential courses of action. And their ability to do that is what lets them adjust to a wider, more diverse, more variable range of environments, which seems to be the ecological niche that leads to this strategy of long development and large brains. Now, the problem with that strategy of having a wide range of solutions to search is that it immediately presents what people both in neuroscience and in computer science call an explore-exploit dilemma. The problem is if you've got a very wide range of solutions to consider, then you have to decide whether what you should do is just go to a solution that's very close, very similar to the solutions that you already know about and that have already been successful, or whether you should search more widely through that broad space of solutions to try and find a solution. The problem is if you use the exploit strategy, do essentially the things that you've done before that have been successful, you're more likely to quickly and efficiently find an okay answer, an answer that will more or less work. The disadvantage is that you might very well miss a solution that's further away in the space that would actually be better off in the long run. So you're likely to get stuck in a kind of local optimum where it looks as if this solution has always worked for you in the past, but there's actually a better solution that you won't get to. On the other hand, if you choose the explore route, if you try to look as widely through the space as you possibly can, since you're an intelligent animal and you have a big space to search, you have the problem that you might be wasting a lot of time considering solutions that actually aren't going to be successful. So the explore solution is less efficient in the short run, but it might actually be better for you in the long run. Again, particularly if you're in a variable, diverse, unpredictable kind of environment. And one way that people in computer science have talked about this is in terms of a contrast between narrower and more low temperature searches versus broader high temperature searches. So the idea is you think about a box full of hypotheses or full of solutions, and you're at a particular place in this box, one way that you can search through the box is to just have a low temperature search where you're looking nearby. Another thing you could do is bounce around, move very easily from one solution to another, not require a lot of evidence to get to another space in another part of the solution space. And there's an intrinsic trade-off, an intrinsic tension between these two kinds of strategies. There isn't a simple way of just saying, this is the strategy that you should use in a particular context. And the way that this gets solved in computer science, in work that goes back a long way, is often by using something that's called simulated annealing. And this is a very, very simple kind of search problem. You're trying to find the maximum value in this graph. And you can see that if you just look very near to the place that you already are, you might get stuck in one of these local optima. And the solution is to, on the other hand, if you're bouncing around the space all the time, you're not actually going to settle on the right solution. And the solution is to start out with a high temperature exploratory search and then gradually cool off, gradually settle on this less exploratory, more exploit strategy. And this idea of starting out by exploring and moving to exploiting is something that seems to be very generally effective, although we can talk about that some more. And what I proposed is that something like this may be going on in the transition from childhood to adulthood for all creatures, but especially for human beings. We start out with this kind of broad exploratory search, and then we cool off to the more specific search. And this may involve a combination of just the fact that we don't know as much to begin with, sort of automatically by having a flatter prior to begin with, you're going to have a wider search. And as we'll see in a minute, it may also be something intrinsic to the difference between being a child and being an adult, something intrinsically developmental. Now, this general picture fits quite well with what we know about neural development. So there's at least a couple of things that we know about how the brain develops. One thing that we know is that there's this early period. This is the classic figure from Huttenlocher. There's this early period of synaptogenesis when many, many new connections are being formed. And then there's a later period where connections that have been formed become myelinated, become strengthened, become more efficient. And connections that aren't exercised are pruned, are discarded. And one of the consequences of that is that in the early period, not only is there more synaptogenesis, but there's more local synaptogenesis. So you have a situation where you have lots of local activation early on, and then you have fewer but more efficient long-distance networks later on in development. Another thing that happens particularly in human beings is that we have more and more frontal control. So a lot of those networks in human beings are networks that involve frontal areas of the brain coming in and having more and more control over other parts of the brain. So there seems to be a very general neural strategy, which is start out with lots of plasticity, start out with lots of potential synapses, and then change that brain into one where there's less plasticity but more efficiency. So you have an early brain that's very well designed for picking up information from the environment, very plastic, very good at doing things that are new. You have a later brain that's much more efficient, much more effective, much better at doing the things that it can do, much less good at being flexible. And in fact, there's empirical evidence in neuroscience. Sharon Thompson-Schill's the person who I think has made this argument most vigorously, that in fact, although that frontal control is extremely important for exploit kinds of intelligence, really important for things like long-term planning, executive function, inhibition, it actually has exactly the trade-offs you'd expect from an explore-exploit perspective in that it leads to less exploration, less divergence, less creativity broadly considered. And there's quite a bit of evidence to suggest that this is true. Now, if you think about childhood from this perspective of this explore. Oh, let me mention something else that I think is interesting, which is this kind of developmental trajectory is really characteristic of brains, human brains and brains in general, and yet it hasn't been imported into artificial neural networks, for example. So although there's been a few exceptions, most of the time what happens is that you simply have a learning network that just keeps doing the things that it's doing as it gets more and more data, rather than having this transition from an early period that's using one kind of strategy and then a later period that seems to be using quite a different kind of strategy. One of the consequences of this view, and this is a point that Sharon Thompson-Schill has made as well, is that from this perspective, what seem like bugs in childhood may actually be features. So a too common way of thinking about childhood in neuroscience and in adult cognitive psychology and even in developmental psychology is thinking about children as if they're sort of defective grown-ups. So the way to think about development is how is it that we manage to achieve the amazing perfection of being a 35-year-old white male neuroscience professor. And from this perspective, but that's not very sensible from an evolutionary perspective. So if you think about those chickens, if it was so fabulous to have a frontal lobe, there's no reason why we couldn't have a frontal lobe in place from the time we're born. From this perspective, some of the things that we think of as bugs in childhood may actually be features. So the fact that children are notoriously noisy, both metaphorically and actually, that they're variable, that they seem to engage in much more random kinds of behavior. The fact that they actually have these executive function deficits, that they're impulsive, that they're bad at inhibition. The fact that they spend a lot of time involved in play, things that by definition play is not something that's actually going to be a productive, immediately productive activity. The fact that they're curious to the point that they often put their future evolutionary survival in danger. The fact that they require so much investment and care from the adults around them. All those things that might look like bugs, and in particular might look like cognitive bugs, things that even the great psychologist Jean Piaget pointed to as deficits in children, irrationalities in children, from this explore-exploit trade-off perspective, might actually be features. These might be things that are terrible if you want to go out in the world and do things, which is why we have to do all the things that we do for children, but are very good strategies from the perspective of trying to get as much information about the world and explore as many possibilities as you possibly can. Now, in terms of, all right, that's a nice theoretical story. Is there actually any reason to believe that it's true? Well, over the past 20 years now, really, I started writing about this in 2000. I've been arguing, and other developmental psychologists have been arguing for a picture of development that I think of as the theory 2.0. That's thinking about cognitive development, and particularly the development of intuitive theories of the world around us, as a process of constructing generative, probabilistic Bayesian models from statistical data. And over the past 20 years, these are two review articles about this, there's been now hundreds and hundreds of studies that have shown that if you give children, even babies, particular kinds of patterns of data that support, say, a particular kind of causal hypothesis, and you give them a choice between two hypotheses to pick given that data, children are amazingly good at picking the hypothesis that is most compatible with the data from the perspective of a kind of Bayesian generative probabilistic model. So they consistently are picking the hypothesis that has the highest posterior given the data, which I think is really a fairly remarkable thing to have discovered. Now, as everyone knows, though, there's a catch to these kind of Bayesian probabilistic models views. And that catch is, well, sure, if you have a choice between two hypotheses or three hypotheses, and you have to figure out which one has the highest posterior, and you have a particular set of data, then it's easy to implement Bayesian reasoning. But in the real world, especially in the real world for an intelligent creature with a wide search space like ours, it's impossible to actually click through every potential hypothesis you might have and evaluate it given the strength of a particular data set. So the search problem for these kind of generative models, particularly for models that are complex enough to be interesting, becomes unbelievably hairy very, very quickly. Very, very difficult problem to solve. In fact, completely computationally intractable problem. So I think we've gone from saying, is something like this going on in children or in adults, to saying, how can we solve this very hairy search problem? And one idea that we've argued for and we have a bunch of empirical data for is what we call the sampling hypothesis. In computer science, the typical way that this problem gets solved is by using some kind of sampling procedure. So rather than trying to test every single hypothesis, which you can't possibly do, there are various ways that you can randomly select hypotheses to test in a way that enables you, at least in asymptopia, as a statistician friend of mine says, to approximate Bayesian inference. And we've shown that something like this, some of the signatures of this kind of sampling are again in place even in very young children, but that would be a different talk. But of course, that sampling process exactly raises this kind of explore-exploit trade-off problem. And that's particularly true if what you're trying to do is learn pretty abstract, general, what philosophers call over-hypotheses, learn general principles rather than just learning specific details of a particular hypothesis. And what actually happened was that we started out with a research program where we wanted to see whether children could learn these higher level abstract over-hypotheses. This is work with Tom Griffiths, who's done really beautiful formal modeling in what are called hierarchical Bayesian models, showing how it's possible to learn a more abstract general hypothesis from data that's coming in at the more specific level. We wanted to see if children could do this. And the rather remarkable thing that we discovered, spoiler alert, is that not only could children do this, but that children, in some circumstances, were better at doing this than adults. And let me just quickly go through the method. Well, all of this work has done, or a lot of it, has used this very simple device, the Blicket detector. The Blicket detector is a box that lights up and plays music when some things get put on it and not others. And we can use this device to give children patterns of statistical data and then see what kinds of inferences they make about the causal structure of the device, about how the device works. In particular, we can see how they try to make the device activate. So here's an example of our Blicket detector experiments. Some of you here may have already seen this. You guys, those of you who haven't seen it can be participants. You see the machine, you see that D goes on the machine 3 times and nothing happens, E goes on and nothing happens, D and F together go on and the machine lights up twice in a row. And the question is D a Blicket? Okay, is E a Blicket? Is F a Blicket? Okay, great. So as I would expect, this audience is as smart as Berkeley undergraduates, but possibly not as smart as 4-year-olds, because what if you also saw this sequence of events? You see that A, B, and C all go on the machine, A and B make it go, B and C make it go, but A and C, don't make it go, but A and C does make it go. Now, if you saw this sequence of events, you might say, oh, wait a minute, I thought the general principle about how this machine worked was that individual objects either made it go or didn't. I thought it worked on a kind of noisy OR logic, which is the way that most causal systems work. But maybe this machine actually doesn't have that kind of noisy OR logic. Maybe this has a kind of conjunctive logic where combinations of blocks are necessary to make the machine go. You need to have 2 blocks, 2 particular blocks to make the machine go. And if you saw that sequence of events, and now you went back to that original sequence, you might say, oh, I see, I was too constrained by my prior over-hypothesis about the way the machine worked. If the machine worked on this really different principle, then maybe D and F are actually both Blickets. And what we've done now is just done that experiment that I just described with you with many, many 4-year-olds and adults. I'll just give you a quick example of how this looks. Oops. Oh, maybe not, because we didn't think about the. Sorry, we have neither sound nor time, so we'll have to skip the cute kid videos. We do have sound, okay? Well, we still don't have time, but. What is life without cute kid videos? How's that? Oh, okay. All right, well, again, in the interest of time, trust me that there's an incredibly cute kid video here. If you search online, you can actually find it. But the bottom line is that when we gave that experiment, we did that experiment with undergraduates and with 4-year-olds. What we discovered was that the undergraduates would go with the disjunctive, the individual hypothesis, even when they had data to the contrary. So their strong prior for the way that the machine worked overrode the data that they had that suggested that the machine worked on this other general principle. Whereas the 4-year-olds were very consistently would choose the individual, the disjunctive hypothesis if that was what the data suggested, and choose the conjunct hypothesis if that was what the data suggested. So in other words, the 4-year-olds were searching a part of the space that the adults were not. And that raised an interesting question, which is that because, as I mentioned before, is this a kind of gradual change with accumulated experience, where what's happening is that the 4-year-olds just don't have very much experience with how machines work, and as they develop a more and more peaked prior about causal systems, they're less willing to override the prior given evidence? Or is it actually something about life history? Is it something about being a child, about being a 4-year-old that's making this difference? So in order to test that, what we did was actually look at people across the entire range of development. So here's the results for the 4 and 5-year-olds and adults. This is the proportion saying that D is obligate, as well as F. And what we discovered was that 6 to 7-year-olds, kids who are probably not coincidentally going to school, are less likely to be flexible compared to the 4 to 5-year-olds. But there isn't a difference between the 6 to 7-year-olds and 9 to 11-year-olds. So over that entire school age period, children are behaving in about the same way. But there's a big drop just at adolescence, and the adolescents aren't statistically different from the adults. And that suggests that there might be something about these life history transitions from preschool to school age, and then from adolescence to adulthood, from school age to adolescence, that really is making a difference in the kind of strategy that the children are using. And just to give you a little more the data, you can see that in the conjunctive, these 2 lines at the bottom are the case where you actually have no evidence, or you have evidence in favor of the likely hypothesis, the disjunctive hypothesis, and you don't see the same kind of strong shifts at life history in those 2 conditions, in the control conditions, but you do in the case where there's actually evidence for the unlikely hypothesis. And that's true also if you look at the interventions the children perform. Is this just something about weird children, as they say, about Western educated, industrialized, rich children? Or is this a very general principle about how children work? So to test that, what we did was tested children in Head Start programs in Oakland, and we actually went all the way to Peru, and we tested children who were growing up in essentially favelas, low-income communities outside of Peru, and we discovered that these children, somewhat to our surprise, were just as flexible. First of all, we're just as good at solving these causal inference tasks, and in particular, we're just as flexible. If anything, the Peruvian children were more flexible than the typical American children, and Peruvian undergraduates were just as inflexible as the Western undergraduates. I'll just mention we're in the midst of doing some research at the moment with hunter-gatherers, actually, in Amazonia. And the hunter-gatherer adults are the first group of adults we've tested, and we've tested literally thousands of adults now, who look like they might be showing some of the same kind of flexibility as the children, which is an intriguing finding that we have various kinds of hypotheses for. And now it turns out that if you look at across the literature, both other work that we've done and work that other people have done, you find that although almost always kids do worse on various kinds of tasks than adults do, there's a whole range of tasks that have this character of trying to search for an unlikely solution, of having to involving this broader high-temperature search, where children actually do better than adults. And this is work that we've done on social tasks, on understanding relational concepts, on searching semantic networks, and also work in linguistics and work on insight task solving. So if you look at this, most of the time the exploit strategy is going to be a better strategy, or at least is more likely to get you to the solution that you want. But if the problem involves trying to do something unlikely or unusual, finding an unlikely solution, then I think there's quite a bit of evidence that children are actually doing better at extracting that kind of information than adults are. And of course, it's just a baseline is that we know that in the first 5 or 6 years of life, children are doing an unbelievable amount of learning new theories, learning new languages in a way that seems to really outstrip anything that adults can do. What we've been doing most recently, empirically, is trying to actually see if we could take this explore-exploit idea and test it across development. And I'm just going to give one example. This is work with my wonderful graduate student, Emily Lequin. Just one example of a study that we've just finished. In the adult literature, there's quite a lot of work about these kind of explore-exploit situations. And what that work suggests is that adults in particular are unlikely to explore options that might lead to risk or loss. And here's a very simple kind of experiment that shows this. So what happens is it's like a blicket detector experiment. You see a machine and you can put an object on it. And what happens is some objects not only make the machine light up or not, but they actually either give you stickers or lose you stickers. So if you see that object in the middle, you're actually going to lose 2 stickers. But if you see any of the other 3 objects, you're going to gain a sticker. And the setup is that you can decide whether or not you want to test an object by putting it on the machine. But if it's a good object, you'll get a sticker. And if it's a bad object, then you'll lose stickers. And what the adult literature suggests is that adults are very hesitant. They tend to avoid the ones that they think are going to lead to losses, which is generally a good strategy. But one consequence of that is that they don't actually learn how the system works. So in this particular case, for example, there's actually a 2-dimensional rule about which blocks will reward you and which ones won't. So it has to be, a block has to be both yellow and, has to have both black things on it, and those black things have to be striped in order for it to be the negative, in order for it to lead to the negative reward. But if you just saw that block once, you might think, oh, all objects that have black on them are risky, or all objects that have stripes on them are risky. And that's exactly what adults do. So what we discovered was that when we gave this kind of test to adults and children of different ages, what happened was that the 4 to 5-year-olds were much more likely to test the blocks than either the 6 to 7-year-olds or especially the adults. And in particular, they were more likely to test the blocks that potentially had this kind of negative valence. So in some ways, the children were losing. They were putting blocks on the machine that were actually causing them to lose stickers. But on the other hand, at the end of the experiment, we asked them, how does the machine work? And when we did that, we discovered that the children were actually doing better than the adults. So the fact that the children were actually willing to risk the loss meant that they got more information, which meant that now they understood what the general principle was behind the machine. And presumably, at some later point, understanding that that was the general principle would help them to exploit. So the children were willing to risk the losses. They were willing to do the trade-off of risking the losses that come with exploration in a way that the adults were not. And the result of that was that the children were actually getting information that the adults were not. And what we're doing now, there's a very interesting question about, is this something that is just making the children smarter, or it could also be that some of the things that, again, have been thought of as being bugs about children, like the fact that they're impulsive, that they just put the block on even though it looks as if it's going to lead to a loss, that behavior that might look kind of stupid from the exploit perspective actually turns out to be smart from the explore perspective. The last thing I want to talk about is some new work and ideas. It's sort of come out of left field, but I think is actually very informative about this. And this is recent work looking at the effects of psychedelic chemicals and psychedelic drugs. And one of the things that's come out of this new work looking at the neuroscience of psychedelics is that psychedelics seem to mimic many of the characteristics of childhood brains. So, for example, this is a paper that just came out And even at the cellular level, the effects of psychedelics seem to be to cause synaptogenesis. It causes dendritic spines. It also turns the cells tie-dye, as you can see from this picture, but I think that was just a nice, vivid way of demonstrating this. So in fact, it looks as if one of the effects of psychedelics is that psychedelics actually promote structural and functional neuroplasticity. That's actually the title of this new paper. And of course, that kind of structural and functional plasticity is exactly characteristic of childhood. Another characteristic of psychedelics is that they deactivate these frontal control networks, which seem to be the things that are being constructed across development. In particular, they deactivate both frontal control networks and the default mode network, and we have pretty good evidence that both the control networks and the default mode network are things that are being constructed relatively late in development, and that deactivation seems to be correlated with the effects of the substances. And there's also some evidence that one of the effects of these substances is they increase local connectivity and they decrease this long-distance network segregation. Again, very much paralleling the characteristics of childhood. So it's sort of like all the things that happen in development are being reversed under the effects of psychedelic drugs. And if you think about the cognitive effects of these drugs, they also seem to parallel many of the things that we think of as cognitive effects of childhood, both for good or for ill. So there's less executive function, less ego, but there's also more imagination, more vivid imaginative phenomenology, like the kind of thing that you see in children's pretend play or their imaginary companions, and there's less top-down control. Now, from a computational perspective, quite independently of the work that we've done in development, a number of people have suggested that what might be happening under psychedelics is very similar to what we've argued is happening with childhood from a computational perspective. Namely, that what psychedelics are doing is loosening top-down control. They're flattening priors. And the result of that under psychedelics as well as in childhood is this ability to explore parts of the space that had not been explored before. And perhaps the most striking recent hypothesis about so one of the things that's come out of this research is the therapeutic effects of psychedelics. So at least in research that's starting, it seems as if they're remarkably effective at, for conditions like depression and anxiety. And the sort of hypothesis about what's happening is that those the effects of the drugs is exactly to widen the search of possible solutions, widen the search of possible hypotheses that, that people are willing to consider. And a way of thinking about things like depression is precisely that they narrow the range of options that you consider and that they involve too much impact from top-down control and constraint. So one way that I like to think about this is that you could think that what psychedelics do for individuals is what children do for the species. So psychedelics shake you out of local optima the same way that children shake an entire community, shake the species out of local optima with each succeeding generation. And I like the idea of thinking about, if it kind of makes sense if you know 4-year-olds. So let me just mention some open questions that are still open. One question is, how does this all fit with the kind of framework of reward, motivation, and so forth? Is the right way to think about it that children are just released from the constraints of things like reinforcement learning? Or is the right way to think about it that children have a different reinforcement schedule, that they're designed so that things like information gain and model building actually are the things that count as reinforcers for children? Or is it that they're just in a different world than the reward-based world of adults? Something that I've mentioned before, how much of this is just the result of having more noise in children, and how much of it is strategic? And I think the evidence goes both ways. So sometimes it looks as if what's happening is that both in terms of their actions and in terms of their neural activity, the children are just noisier, and it's that noise that's enabling them to search more widely. I mean, that's the very idea of high temperature, is that this is a kind of more entropic system. That's also an idea people have had about the psychedelics. But it doesn't look as if what children are doing is just completely random. They also seem to be choosing hypotheses that in some sense are sensible hypotheses, hypotheses. There's a lot of evidence that in their play, they're doing experiments that actually are experiments that are going to give them more information. So I think that's a really important, interesting question and computational question that comes up. And finally, this question about how much of this is the result of changes in priors and how much of it is the result of these kind of life history changes in the very nature of the search strategy that you use. So I hope the moral of this is not only that we should be thinking about cognitive science in computation and brain at the same time, but that thinking about development, which is often seen as being sort of something different, is actually really key, really fundamental from a biological perspective, a computational perspective, and a neuroscience perspective to answering some of these big questions about how we can find out as much about the world as we do. All right, I'll stop there and take some questions. Do we have a mic for questions or? Yeah, I guess we do. Are there questions? Yeah. Are there any women in the audience, by the way, who have questions? My experience is that women come and ask all the good questions at the end. Yeah.
What about sleep? So on a
Yeah.
day-time scale, is there a sense of brain states we experience when we're asleep having any kind of similarity to childhood, besides the fact, or my understanding, that children do sleep?
Yeah, I mean, one of the really interesting characteristics of childhood is that there's much more sleep, and in particular, much more REM sleep in childhood than there is later on. And again, that's one of these things we just sort of take for granted, but it's kind of puzzling. Why are children doing that? And in fact, I think there's quite a good argument to be made that the kinds of sleep-wake cycles that you're talking about also are designed to resolve these kind of explore-exploit trade-offs. And sleep is paradoxical in just the way childhood is. I mean, why is it that we're lying there completely helpless for big sections of the day? And the thought would be the kinds of things we need to act effectively in waking life are the opposite of the kinds of systems that we need to be able to learn and consolidate information that we've got during the day. So this is a kind of appealing idea that if you think about psychedelic experience, dreaming childhood experience, is an idea that people have had, that those might actually have a lot in common. But rather than thinking of those things as being irrational, crazy, primary process, whatever, that those are actually states that are serving really, really important computational functions. Yeah? Uh-huh.
I'm imagining my box of hypotheses and
Right.
good. And childhood bounces around, and then as I grow, I'm landing on someplace. Is that a hypothesis space of brain connections? But we know that not every region is connected to every other region, so those are kind of fixed. Is it a hypothesis over cognitive models of how the world works, like pigs can fly? No, everything crawls. Like, are we what over what space are we bouncing around? And how does that relate to maybe an idea of where you learn one thing and then learn off the next thing?
Right.
Those seem almost counter to me. So I'm wondering how you think about those ideas.
So the inspiration for this originally came from this work that we've done on the theory, where we have pretty specific ideas about what causal hypotheses look like, for example. So what's your causal hypothesis about how the machine works, and you can actually represent that as a generative model, and then we can very specifically and rigorously say, here's the space of generative models that you're searching over, and say, are you getting to this part of the space or that part of the space? So for specific things like the Blickett detector, I think we can specify, here's what the range of hypotheses actually look like. And that's true for things like our intuitive psychology or our intuitive biology, or our phenology, for example. I think it's an interesting question about how generally, is there a way of generally characterizing this? And even if you think about something like reinforcement learning, which people typically don't think of as involving hypotheses or models, you could think of it as strategies, and people have talked about explore-exploit trade-offs in terms of things like deciding which action to perform. So I think that's the kind of context in which I'm thinking of it. And then I think it's an interesting question about how is what looks like a somewhat similar process in neural development, how is that connected to the cognitive the cognitive processes and the cognitive changes that are taking place. And how's this related to what you could do in an artificial system, for instance. By the way, I've been spending a lot of time recently, especially talking to people who are actually doing AI at places like DeepMind and Facebook. And the interesting thing is, one always assumes that somebody else knows more than you do. So I said, well, you guys must know how annealing works and what the best schedules are and how to do it. And essentially what they say is, we handcraft. We use annealing all the time, and we basically figure out how to monkey with it to make it do what we want in a particular context. Aside from the very basic idea of annealing, start out broad and then cool off, there isn't actually very much theoretical work about exactly how and why it works for what kinds of problems. So I think that's a real important frontier. Yeah? The question?
So perhaps more knowledgeable side,
Yeah.
results for adults and children. So we
Yeah.
perhaps more from economic side, we tend to use incentive compatibility, and so that we can reasonably be sure that participants are maximizing certain thing in the experiment.
Right.
Can we be reasonably sure about the same thing that children are doing the same
Yeah.
thing?
Well, of course,
Can we
that's
then
a
compare the results?
Yeah, that's a big methodological challenge, and that's the reason why we have the control conditions. I went through them rather quickly, where, for instance, if you look at the situation in which the hypothesis is the obvious hypothesis, right, where it's the likely hypothesis, then we don't see the same kinds of developmental patterns. So it's not that children are, say, always, and we think about this a lot as developmentalists, maybe it's that children just always say that everything is obligate, or maybe it's that children are just always thinking that you should try more things rather than fewer things. So that's why it's important to have control conditions where we can show that if we change the structure of the task, we see something that looks more like the typical developmental sequence. But it is a real question and a real problem that one of the things we've discovered is adults are incredibly good pragmatically at figuring out what experimenters want. So it's hard to actually have a setup where adults aren't kind of sussing out, here's the thing that you really want. And we sort of stumbled on that with obligate detectors because the adults think that they're being really smart by choosing the hypothesis that has by choosing the likely hypothesis. So that is definitely something that's a challenging problem. Another thing that I think is helpful is the fact that we see these discontinuities across development, which suggests that it isn't just something simple that we know is increasing across development. But as always in developmental psychology, it's all about the control conditions. That's always the secret.
I was wondering if you would think that there should be critical periods really for everything, and I don't know if it's also empirical evidence.
Yeah, so it's an interesting question. I think this gives one a different picture about what critical periods are about. The general wisdom is that rather than thinking in terms of critical periods, a better way of thinking about it is in terms of sensitive periods. And I think if you think about these kinds of changes in flexibility, that would be a good example of that. So, even the adults, if you sit there and tell them, look, the way this works is that it's conjunctive, can get to the less likely hypothesis, but it's just much more, it requires more attention, it requires more intellectual work, it requires more data to get them there than it does with the children. And I think that's a good way of thinking about the way that critical and sensitive periods work. So that having these periods where you're more, and another interesting question that we don't know is this domain specific? So it may be one interesting little tidbit is that, as I said, we have a version of this where the hypotheses are social rather than being physical. They're about explaining why someone acted the way they did. And what we discovered with that was that we saw the same difference between 4-year-olds and adults, the same difference between 4-year-olds and 6-year-olds. But when we tested adolescents, adolescents were actually the most flexible in a social setting. And that suggests that these periods might be different in different domains at different times. And that's consistent with the neuroscience evidence, which suggests that you might have this real reintroduction of plasticity in adolescence for relevant phenomena like social phenomena. And the same thing might be true with language, for example, where you see the real flexibility in language and phonologies in infancy is really, really early, much before we see it in other areas. So I think it might very well be that this is going to be different across different domains.
Regarding creativity and creative work, specifically scientific
Right.
So it used to be thought that if you're a mathematician and you don't do your best work by age
Yeah.
30 or some, there's new work questioning that you can have past your unity point during your career. One could imagine that that's a cooling of the temperatures progressively, but I'd like to hear your view on that.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really interesting question. And my general picture is that what happens in adulthood is that you, not surprisingly, what you get is this kind of meta phenomenon where what you're trying to do is decide when should I explore and when should I exploit. So I don't think adults are ever going to be as good at wide-ranging exploration as the children, but adults will in fact have the advantage that, you know, the children are just exploring no matter what, whether it's going to be productive or not. If you look at something like that pretend play, they're just trying a million crazy things. They're not even thinking about whether it's going to be productive. And adult creativity demands that you actually pick and choose among the kinds of explorations that you're going to engage in. So I think for adults, the real challenge is how do you know when to switch back and forth, and how do you search the space in a way that's the right kind of way of searching the space. And I think it's a real question about whether adults do it. Perhaps this is just autobiographical, but an interesting possibility that I've thought about, Lynn Hasher has some work about this. I mentioned that one of the other distinctive things about our life history is that we have this period of postmenopausal grandmotherhood, which only killer whales, who are also, by the way, highly intelligent cultural species, have. And an interesting, and one of the things we know is that this kind of frontal control gets loosened in later age as well. And an interesting possibility is, as with adolescence, that for certain kinds of domains, we return to this kind of flexibility as postmenopausal grandmothers in a way that we can't when we're stuck in that, you know, super evolutionary 4Fs, Buddhist Maya phase of life where we're just trying to accomplish our goals as quickly and successfully as we possibly can and mate and reproduce and predate and do all that. And then the utopian picture is that when you get above 50, you get released from that and you can actually start exploring possibilities again. And I don't think that's crazy. I mean, some of the evidence about the increase in happiness later in life might actually be relevant to that possibility.
Maybe on such a lovely note to
Okay.